And so we decided to take a class of students and start in Memphis and go all the way down the river to New Orleans and explore all sorts of issues about flood control and try to examine whether this was the biggest flood that could possibly happen, whether there's a bigger one down the road, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the system. But rather than go into a long story about it, I'm going to let the students tell you their story. And I think I'm going to start by just asking the group as a whole, and Bracy Harris is going to join us when she gets here. She's running late, something about a bus, an issue that should be familiar to many of you. I'm just going to ask the group, what was the most challenging part about this course for you? Who wants to volunteer?
I'll go. Is this on? Okay. I'd say the most challenging part was, so in dealing with this subject, we had to deal with a lot of like technical jargon. The Corps of Engineers did a great job helping us out, but still there's all kinds of just engineer language that everyone else in the world doesn't use. So I'd say that was the biggest challenge for me, was trying to sift through all that and reword, their reports and their documents into language that people were going to want to read and understand when they read.
I think the biggest challenge for me was adding a personal aspect to the story. It's kind of like what Peyton said. Everything in the story is so technical. You're dealing with numbers and scientific language rather than language that's easy to read. And so finding the story, going to where the Corps of Engineers worked, understanding what they did, but also adding a personal aspect to the story, which we had to do through getting interviews with people and kind of adding just a little flavor to the scientific nature of the writing.
This was my first journalism course, really. I'm an English major, and I had to learn, I know how to tell a story. I had to learn how to find the story, kind of like what you were saying, how to make it personal, but how to be speaking to these people in the Corps of Engineers and listen to what they're saying and these big words that they're using and their Cajun language that they're using and trying to understand it and trying to really find a story. But I think I did that. I think we all did that. So.
Is it true that you interviewed a man on top of a pickup truck?
I did. I interviewed a shirtless man on top of a pickup truck. I interviewed a mayor in Henderson, Louisiana, in his shrimping boat. He said, "You can interview me, but I have to go. Let's go shrimp." So I got on the boat with my little recorder, and yeah, so it was good.
Yeah, I think kind of what they said, one of the hardest things about this is taking such a dense topic and making it readable, because it is flood control and levees and everything that people are just not very familiar with. And so it was really challenging to just put it all into a story and make it, because we want you to read it and enjoy reading it, not be like, this is boring, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it's making it where you can understand it. But it was a great exercise to be able to do that, because now I feel like I can take something really confusing like levees and explain it to you in a story.
Blake?
Yeah, for me, I think it wasn't even the reporting part. For me, reporting was big too, because I definitely didn't have any personal aspects to my stories. I wrote about a museum and channelization or maintaining the river and trying to keep it up to par with the standards that they set. And so that was difficult to write about, just because I actually am more of a fiction writer in my other classes. I like to focus on stories, and also I think, but the bigger problem for me was the deadline, the fact that it was a deadline that was set at the beginning of the course far in advance, and so you had all this time to set up and write it, and I was just kind of ooh, blessing and a curse, because it gives you all the time to work on it, but it also gives you a lot of time to not work on it. And I don't believe I had any issues getting it in on time, but it was definitely one of those things I had to make sure I kept on top of. So that was probably my biggest fear, but was able to deal with. So not too bad.
Before we went on our trip during spring break, it's actually a class throughout the semester. And Bill would give us article after article after article that would be related to the river or be about Frank Sinatra and his cold. So like it could be anything in between, but just to gain a perspective on how to write leads or how to get emotion out of stories. And we're not all journalism majors, so we haven't all been through the technical classes that teach you how to do these things. And so going into this, my stories were about one of my stories was about the people that chose to live on this lake that they knew would flood if a river came, and their house would be destroyed, more or less. And so it was really learning how to talk to people about these absolutely traumatic situations they've been in, and you have no idea what they've experienced. And you're going to experience that if y'all decide to do journalism and news reporting, that you have to deal with people and you have to be able to get on their level and really respect the things they've been through, whether it's something like a flood or a death or something that they've been celebrating. And so as a journalist, you really have to learn how to get to know your sources and be able to respect them, but also be able to tell their story for them.
The hardest part for me was probably condensing all the information that we learned over the semester, because we were going on trips on the weekends to interview people. Spring break was totally spent interviewing people nonstop. And then we also had to do a lot of research, and the Corps of Engineers actually produced a book that kind of, I guess, could be comparable to our magazine, and it was 300 pages long, and that didn't even include any interviews with actual people. And we had to sift through all of that information and put it in a magazine that is 84 pages long. And I remember whenever I started to write, I was sitting at High Point, and I had 2 tables together with stuff covering all of the tables, and I had probably 12 tabs opened on my computer. I mean, there was just so much to go back and forth between and try to decide what could make it in the magazine. And so, we just went through a lot of edits, and Bill kind of continued to help us and sift through things that did need to be there and things that didn't. And we got an 84-page magazine.
I also struggled, like Ben, with condensing. I come from a different discipline. I'm a Southern Studies major. And so I'm like the person that turns in 2 extra pages on a paper because I can't cut it down. And so in journalism, you definitely can't do that. So you're trying to make your story interesting and not be these pumps cost $220 million a year and $2 million a year to operate and blah, 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 blah. And that's so boring. So I think that if you guys get a chance to take a class in a different discipline, you definitely should, because I learned a completely different writing style. So.
And Bracy, don't worry, Bracy gets an excuse. She told me she was going to be late. But what I asked him was, what was the most challenging aspect about this course for you?
I guess the most challenging aspect would really just be being put outside of my comfort zone, because I had worked for the Daily Mississippian before, but usually my stories were on campus and with professors and students. And really with Mr. Rose, when we went to the King's community in Vicksburg, which was an impoverished community, we were really just, or rather he was knocking on doors to complete strangers, to talk to them. And I mean, that was something different. We weren't emailing or calling ahead of time to set up appointments with people. We tried, and in several cases that didn't work out. So it was just, randomly going to people and asking them would they talk to us about their experiences, which is what real journalism is. It isn't always organized. So really getting my feet wet in that aspect of the practice was probably the most challenging but rewarding process of the whole experience.
Okay, I'm going to ask some individual questions, and I'm going to start with Bracy, because you mentioned something right there at the end about just meeting strangers and interviewing them. Describe that. What did you learn from that? How awkward was that when you first started doing it, and how did it work out?
Okay. Well, the first house we went to, do I need to give a little background on Kings? Okay, Kings is a small little community in Vicksburg, which has faced flooding every year. But a lot of the residents have chose to stay because it has a historical significance. It's where some of the first freed slaves, established a community in Vicksburg. So there's a lot of historical significance to it. And the first house we went to was a man, his name was Mr. Joseph Potts. He was 80 years old, remodeling his house. And Mr. Rose was just like, let's go. And he knocked on the door, and I was just really nervous. And it was really Mr. Rose asking and, leading the questions and helping me along because I was just really kind of placed outside of my comfort zone. And I had my little notepad, but the questions weren't coming to me as easily as I had thought about asking an individual that I hadn't met before about their experiences, with such a devastating flood. And so it was really interesting, but it was rewarding. And that man, he talked and he talked, so it was great.
So you think you could do that? You think you could do that much easier the next time?
Yes, I do think I could do it much easier the
Yeah.
next time.
Yeah, because once you got started asking questions, you didn't have any trouble. Let me ask Ben Hurston. Ben had to write the main essay. This is a long story in the front of the book that sums up everything, and it's really, really hard to do. He also laid out the book, but how difficult was it to pull off a story like that and make it really readable?
Well, this kind of goes back to my answer to the last question. The most difficult part about writing the main was we had this huge concept that we knew the magazine was going to be about, and in one story I kind of was trying to sum up all of that and give a picture to set up the rest of the book to go more in depth with all the individual stories, and that was really difficult to choose what to put in there, what not to. I mean, we went through at least 10 edits, and entire halves of of my story were just cut. Nope, we're not going to use that. Let's go in a different direction. And also, we got a lot of our information from the Corps of Engineers, and so we were quoting them a lot, and we were trying to make sure that we weren't writing as an entity for them. We wanted to be separate from them and having an objective view, and it's hard to do that when 90% of your information is coming from one source. So we were constantly trying to check ourselves and make sure that we were being objective. And so anyway, yeah, I guess it was very difficult. It took me probably 4 weeks of just constant writing, and sometimes I'd be sitting in front of my computer for 3 hours, and I would have one paragraph done, and I'd go to Bill and just be like, what do I do here? And yeah, I think finally we got a main that kind of encompassed the whole book.
And you laid out the book. You designed it pretty much single-handedly over the summer on your own time, and I'm forever grateful. But what was that like? Describe that experience. How beneficial was that to you, and what was it like?
That was so rewarding because, to be as connected with this class as all of us were, I knew that someone was going to be designing the book, and that's something that I really enjoy doing and that I want to get better at. And so to be able to continue the process of really putting together this product that we've all worked to create for a full semester, that was awesome because I was looking at the pictures that Mickey and the rest of our team took that we were all there for, and I was reading everyone's articles and taking out pull quotes, and it really was great because I felt like I got to see all of these people's experience in putting the magazine together.
So after studying this river, do you think it will ever break through the Corps' defenses?
Gosh, that is the question. It's funny because when you ask the Corps individuals, the experts who've studied the river for just so many years, they will tell you that you can never be sure of anything and that nature can always throw something that they're not prepared for. But I really got a sense, and I'm interested to see if y'all thought this too, I got a sense that the Corps is really confident with their projects and with their works. And I think if they can stay in the kind of shape that they are, which takes a lot of money and a ton of rebuilding after every flood, I think that they have a pretty good chance of controlling the river, but they would never tell you that, and I probably shouldn't even say that because we heard 1 billion times no. But I think that they do a really good job Yeah, so I'm confident in them.
Peyton, you had to write a blow-by-blow recreation. You had to recreate the flood from start to finish on paper in a limited amount of space, which is a daunting task. Um, what do you think? Do you think that the Corps has conquered the river, that we don't have to worry about the Mississippi River getting past its defenses anymore?
No, no. I mean, one of the best quotes I got for my stories was Kent Parrish. He told me, the good Lord's always going to send something bigger. And when we were talking to them, like they seemed very confident, but at the time, like you've seen pictures, and you can kind of just get the feel of their feelings about whether the river was gonna break through, and they were scared. I mean, they were really scared about what was going to happen. They knew they had a lot of problem spots and places that were severely outdated in maintenance, and so I think it's probably only a matter of time. I mean, they do what they can with the money that they have as far as maintaining, but I think eventually there's going to be, nobody would have said Katrina was going to happen and destroy New Orleans. So I think it'll happen.
How close did we come to disaster?
4 inches, really. I guess that's what Kate, your story was about, right? About the backwater levee. So the entire delta was almost flooded with water trapped in there that wouldn't have been able to get out. 4 inches, yeah, that's how close.
Tell me about, now you did a story on a breach in an old levee.
Right.
On the Arkansas side of the river. Most people don't even know about, but tell them about that and what you saw when you went out there.
Right, okay, so I went to Lake Providence, Louisiana, actually. And so the way the federal levee system works is, so the old levee system does like this all the time. Like S is all the way up the river, and it's very close to the river. But then in the 40s or so, they were like, okay, we'll just cut it off so we don't have to do as much maintenance. So they have this big bow right here, and what they did was just build another levee that basically made this D-shaped piece of land right there in the middle. And then they don't maintain this levee anymore. So it's up to the farmers who are farming this land. And so in Lake Providence, Louisiana, there's this patch of land right here. It's like 12,000 acres, really great, beautiful looking farmland. But it's up to the farmers to maintain that levee. And what happened was, it hasn't been maintained like it should, and had gotten very weak and hadn't had any kind of real maintenance since the 70s. And the river just dug a hole, like came over the top of that levee, and just washed it out. And it filled this, so 12,000 acres from this part to this part was filled with like 12 feet of water. And it left sand from the levee, like 30 feet high. There was just this crater that was still there when we went to go report. And there's like no way you can fix it. Like it's just a hole. And so, it was devastating. That was just, and one of the things, I kind of talked about in one of my stories was that was a little microcosm of what could happen should a mainline levee break. Was, it ruined this land, for who knows how long, maybe the next 100 years or something. You can't move 30 feet of sand over 12,000 acres. So he's maybe going to open a beach or something, who knows. But yeah, I guess that's what happens when things don't happen like they're supposed to.
Margaret Ann, you wrote about the community of people who live over the levee in Greenville. What was that community like? Why do they do that? Why do they live there? Talk about that.
The community is called, it's on Lake Ferguson in Greenville. And when we I don't know if any of y'all have been to Greenville, but it's your typical Delta town. And when we drove over the levee, first of all, you don't even really know it's this wonderful structure that's supposed to save all of this land and homes, and you just drive right over it like it's a little bridge. And we drove into this community, and when we came, it was in like February, I guess. So it was bare already, but because the trees were so bare in the wintertime, you got to see all of the trash that had been washed up from the flood from that lake. And we drove through, and it was just this quaint little community, and we started talking to people. And every home, they said that if they were still there, they wanted to stay because that's where they grew up, or that's where that was their home. That's all they knew. And why would you not want to live on this beautiful lake? And one man described it, and he was describing the colors of the sunset when he looked out over his home. And we kept asking them. I kept asking them, but it's going to flood, and you have to raise your house 16 feet above the ground because that's what the insurance requires, and that's what they're telling you to do, or else you're going to be literally washed away. And some people had moved, and they knew that that's what they had to do because they either couldn't raise their home or their insurance wouldn't pay for this, much similar to what happened during Katrina, if any of you are familiar with all of the homes on the coast. And so some of them did move, and we talked to one man who had come back, and he was obviously very sad about that, and he was going through his pictures and his photo albums of his grandchildren grew up on this lake and all of this. And some people stayed, and they made their homes then a mansion, just about one of the men, and you just saw a real big connection there. And I think that if someone were to tell me to move out of my home that I grew up in from the day I was born, it would be really hard to do. So you have to choose whether you're going to let nature determine the rest of your life, or if you're just going to fight it out.
So they stay there because the ones that stay there because
They love it.
they love it. Yeah. They
Simple
just
as
love
that.
it.
They love it.
They just love it. Okay. So you also wrote a story about something called floodways, and probably most people here don't know what floodways are. But what are they, and how important are they?
The floodways, and all of us, we may have used some language that y'all are unfamiliar with, and it took us a really long time to really understand what we were even writing about. But all in all, the floodways are these structures, and when the water pressure gets so heavy and so forceful, if necessary, they will raise doors, basically, on these structures, and the flood water will just wash out into the floodplain, and that's where the water's supposed to go. And the whole thing with this flood was that everything happened how it was supposed to, and it was not everything worked the way that they had planned. And these flood structures saved basically lots of families and homes, and even though it did destroy some land because of the water, it still did what it was supposed to. And these floodways, the Morganza, the old river control, you may have heard these or seen signs for them. As you're going into New Orleans especially, you'll see these signs for them. And the flood water, I don't want to use numbers. I don't know if they probably won't understand, but like 550,000 cubic feet of water per second is flowing. And these humongous structures, they'll crank up these walls, and the flood water will just wash out. And that's what they had to do. And if you look up, you can even look up a YouTube video, and I can't remember the name of it, but these people literally came out with their picnic baskets and their lawn chairs and watched them raise this door, and the flood water just gushing out like so quickly, and they just stood there and watched it. And people waited and waited and waited to know if they were going to open the floodways, if this was going to happen, and they eventually had to. And yeah, you should go look up that YouTube video of the flood of 2011. It's really interesting. But they stay open until it gets down to a moderate flow, is what they call it. And they keep these doors open so that the water can continue to flow as needed, so that everything will work how it's supposed to.
Yeah, that's good. That's like a big relief valve that lets a bunch of water out and stores it so it doesn't flow over the levees. Let me ask Blair. Blair wrote a piece about the levees. Where would we be without them?
Underwater. Yeah, put really simply, a levee just keeps the river in place. And without levees, we would be underwater. And I think a lot of times, you know, what we found out through our reporting is that a lot of people really take them for granted because you may have seen a levee and you don't even realize that it's a levee because it's just this green slope. It's not, I guess before this class I thought it would be some big brick wall or something, but it's really just a peaceful looking grass slope. And so yeah, my story was on the levees, and what's so impressive about them is that during the 2011 flood, it was just, everyone was so worried about it. They, you know, you see it coming, like it's this, what I call it, the flood wave, like coming down the river, and everyone thought that it was going to top the levees and everything was going to be underwater, it was going to go over. But not a single mainline Mississippi levee was breached during the 2011 flood. And so that's like really impressive. And so just reporting the levees, you know, we talked to the Army Corps of Engineers and really just learned like how the levees are made, and they are highly intricately designed structures. These hills are, it's like hundreds of years of packed dirt and clay, and it's just to keep the river in place. Put really simply, but these engineers, they spend their entire lives, you know, working to do that, so they're really impressive.
So you learned that the biggest threat to the defenses, to the levees, was not water coming over the top, but sand boils, something called sand boils. How many of y'all have heard of sand boils? Raise your hand. Anybody? Dr. Mitchell. A few. So what's a sand boil and why is it so dangerous?
A lot of times what you would think of the most danger, the biggest danger would be water going over the levee, but really it's water that goes under the levee a lot of times that's the biggest threat, because it's, you know, there's just this huge, like Margaret and I was just talking about, this like force of water. It's just incredibly like fast and just this huge force of nature, and it will find its way, the water will creep through like cracks and crevices in the levee and go underneath it and pop up on the other side, and if unchecked, that water will keep flowing and it'll eventually cause a breach in the levee, and the levee will just blow, and then you're underwater again. You've got all this water coming out. So yeah, we talked about how sand boils, how, you know, they do routine daily checks along the levee for just little pools of water to see if they're sand boils. And it's really interesting because if the water is clear in these little ponds on the land side, then it's okay. It's just water coming underneath the levee that's not carrying any dirt or sediment or anything. But if it's muddy, then it is bringing pieces of the levee with it, and then you've got a major problem, and you have to build these things, relief wells, and what do they call them? Redneck relief wells. Yeah. They and they just, you know, it's really funny. Like sometimes they just stick stuff on top of it just to stop it from coming underneath. So yeah, that's what a sand boil is.
Sometimes they build rings around it with sandbags, and you'll see just suddenly these rings of sandbags rising along the levee, and you'll wonder, what in the world is that? They're trying to equalize the pressure. There's pressure down on that water in the river, and then once the pressure equalizes, it stops bubbling, stops going through. Now, you also wrote about an interesting guy named John Ruskey from Clarksdale, who's a river guide. Tell me about John Ruskey and what he did.
Throughout everything that we've written about in this magazine is about how scary and dangerous the river can be and what's going to happen if it floods the land around it. But it was really interesting. I got to go interview a guy called John Ruskey, and he owns the Quapaw Canoe Company in, where was it that we went? Clarksdale. And he is just your typical like river hippie. He's just one with nature, and just so, talking to him was the most interesting thing I think I've ever done. It was so much fun, and it's so like y'all as journalists are going to get to go interview people that sometimes are really interesting and really fun to write on, and this was one. everything he said, the title of this story that I read was called The River Poet, because really when he spoke, it was like a poem. And he would say, the river is my religion, and he basically lives on the river. And it's really cool. He carves his own canoes and owns this Quapaw Canoe Company. And he was really interesting to talk to. He rode the crest of the 2011 flood, like coming down, kind of a daredevil. Yeah.
Think of that. 2 million cubic feet of water per second in the Mississippi River, rolling down. And John Ruskey and his partner jump in a canoe and ride it from Memphis to just north of Vicksburg. So, some would say John's a little crazy. John would say, it was a great experience.
He says the river is his home and he wouldn't live anywhere else. And he says, sure, a bigger flood's going to come. It's going to come in the future, but you just got to kind of accept it and just, it's okay because, the river's our friend, and just accept it, live on the river, and it's all going to be good.
So Kate, did the flood take a toll on the people who battled it?
Yeah, definitely. Especially one person in particular. I ended up interviewing this man who was in charge of the entire Arkansas side of the levee system. His name was Larry Rayburn. And so when we get to the Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg, we took a special trip down there one weekend. And we get there, and I'm like, I'm here to see Larry Rayburn. And immediately, the men who work at the Corps are, like, kind of macho. Like, they're, like, joking with you about going to Ole Miss because most of them went to Mississippi State. And they're, like, really, like, I don't know, the kind of people you think would work at the Corps of Engineers. And so they're like, oh, you're here to see Larry? And they're all, like, telling me to be careful and, like, telling me, he was really affected after the flood. And I'm like, this is a 50-year-old man. I'm sure he's fine. Like, I don't know. And so he was this man who worked at the Corps for 22 years. But he had never really been out in the field, really. He was more of a desk guy. So all of a sudden, he's promoted right before the big flood happens, and he's in charge of, I think, like 75 miles of levee system. And all of a sudden, he's on site working out of this trailer with one internet connection, protecting thousands of people. And it was definitely a lesson in how to empathize with your subject, but not compromise the story, because I wanted to show that, he had all kinds of health problems after this. He had colitis, and, he had insomnia. He couldn't sleep just because he was so stressed out about this big responsibility. And so that was a really important lesson to me. I think it affected everyone that worked at the Corps. They must live under an immense amount of pressure, just thinking about the amount of people they have to protect. So that was definitely interesting.
So, Claire, tell me about, there's something down in Louisiana called the Old River Control Structure. And it's a big, in effect, it's a kind of a dam. The Corps would flinch if you called it a dam. They'd, no, it's a control structure. But it's where the river used to go through Louisiana, and it wants to go there again. But they've constructed this big defense there to keep that from happening, called the Old River Control Structure. So tell us what would happen if the Old River Control Structure failed.
Well, first let me explain what that is a little bit more. It's these like 4 huge like iron metal, like Steven Spielberg looking things that like sit, and they separate the water from the Atchafalaya River to the Mississippi. And the Atchafalaya is kind of like the Mississippi's little sister. But it actually is like, it's a shorter route to the coast. So the river wants to go, more of the water wants to go down the Atchafalaya, but it can't because the water needs to stay going down the Mississippi. So it goes through, by Baton Rouge and by New Orleans to keep the commerce going. What was the question?
So what would happen to New Orleans and South Louisiana if that structure failed?
If the structure failed and if more of the water went down the Atchafalaya, they would just, like the petrochemical plants and really the commerce would just, it would disappear. And that would be devastating for, the economy of New Orleans. It would just dry up.
It would just be in a kind of a salt marsh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how about the people living in South Louisiana?
You mean in the Atchafalaya Basin? Well, they're kind of like what we've been saying, like all these people who just, they love where they live, even though they live in like danger of being like flooded out. These people who live in between the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya River, they get a letter every year from the government saying that if there's a spillway called the Morganza Spillway, and if that opens, they'll be flooded possibly. And so they get a letter every year saying like, be careful, we could open it and you could flood any day during the spring when it floods, whatever. They choose to live there because they love it. And that's something that was really cool. I mean, like I don't live on a river. But these people, they just like, it's, they love it. It's their home. So.
And the Corps told them they would be under how much water once they opened the Morganza and the Old River?
Yeah, one of the big problems was that the Corps released an inundation map to these people in the Atchafalaya Basin, and that's just a map that says how much water could be here if we open the spillway. And they way overestimated how much water was going to be in these places, and so these people like spent all their money for vacation, or just all of their money that they had saved in these kind of like poor towns to like put their stuff in storage lockers or raise their houses. And the water in some of these places didn't come. The water never reached them. And so they were really upset, and they were kind of like, the Corps who cried wolf. And the Corps is like, wouldn't you rather us overestimate than underestimate? So it's a tricky line. It's a tricky line to walk.
Blake, so how about the commercial aspect of the river? It's not just a big river that allows boats to go on it. What is it?
Hello. Well, the river is a highway, essentially. Back in the day, it was just used for canoes and stuff, and Tom Sawyer spent some time there. But what it is now is that the river is kind of like the biggest commercial expressway we have in America in ways, because they used to move, when they first started, probably, I think it said like 140 million tons, and now they're moving over 500 million tons of commerce each year over the river. And it's kind of tough because it takes about 333,000 barges to do that, which is a lot less than it would take if it was by train or by truck or by air. So it's a big deal, and it saves hundreds of billions of dollars in commercial use and stuff like that. So it's pretty
now, in the headlines right now is that the Mississippi River is too dry in places. It's very shallow, and a lot of this commercial traffic is unable to move. How do they fix that? How do they keep the river channel open?
Well, they have a design standard. They set out a master plan a long time ago, said this is what we need the river to be at minimum for these barges to get through, for traffic to work, for commerce. And so what they do is they do channel maintenance. They call it maintenance. And kind of going off what they said earlier, the water's going to do what it wants to do, the river's going to do what it wants to do. So I'm kind of glad they're not like super confident in what the river's doing, because if they were, then that's when Titanic happens. And so them maintaining it is just what they can do best to keep it at the standards they need. A lot of times the river's high and they're like, okay, boats sail. A lot of times the river's low and they're like, okay, we have to go in and do something. So they bring out a lot of channel improvement vessels called dredges, and they will go out and for probably about 1 mile a year, or as best they can, they go out and they will dig and suck up dirt, and they will create different just dikes and chevrons and all these different things that they use to help keep the river in control. They need it at least 9 feet deep, I think, is the minimum they want. And so when the river is low, they go out and they start digging with these huge machines, and I've likened it to vacuum hose attachment with like a dentist drill on the end, because some of them they break up the dirt and they'll suck it up, and then they'll just spit it out into a different part of the river or over the banks and stuff like that. And so everything they do is environmentally safe, though, so no fish are harmed that I know of.
They claim.
They claim, yes. And so when they put dikes and stuff in there, they definitely let me know, like, hey, this is environmentally safe. We work with all these organizations to make sure this is safe for the environment. Most of them are actually beneficial to the environment, like the dikes, the way they build them. It helps build up microorganisms, microplankton, and other things that, I didn't expect to be writing about in the story. But apparently that was a big deal to them, and so I made sure I got it into the story. And it's kind of weird writing stuff like that because you don't want to be PR for the Corps, but you kind of are in a way. And so, I wrote what I learned, and I tried to keep it as real as possible. And so I just think, the funniest part was when they get into the environmental stuff. It's like, I didn't even expect that to be a problem. That's not what I was thinking of, so I'm glad they brought it up because, I'm glad no one else would have asked me that. Like, oh, is that dangerous for the fish? No, it's not.
Sometimes people you interview will bring up the most interesting things on their own.
Yep.
You didn't even think about. Mary Love, you went to New Orleans and you got to look, and we all know what Katrina did to New Orleans. You got to look firsthand at all the new defenses that they've built around the city. Do you think New Orleans is safe now?
Looking at the structures they built was unreal. We were standing up there and it was like fortress-like structures. They were just massive, and they've done everything they can to prepare. But it's like Ben said, if you ask them, they'll say, no, we don't know. No, it could flood, but we're doing everything we can. And also it's like what Claire said, they're in a catch-22 because they have to do as much as they can, and they have to get money from the government to do that. And it's hard to justify building it if there's no flood in sight. And so I think it's a hard line to walk, like saying y'all could be flooded, you need to do this as precaution. But then if nothing happens, people get frustrated with the Corps. But people are even more frustrated if something does happen and they weren't prepared. But seeing those structures, you know that they've done everything in their power to build it as high as they can and do it as well as they can. But they have such a respect for the river and such a respect for what can happen that I think they're always on the cautionary side and always taking more precautions.
Yeah. So what's the attitude of the people there in New Orleans towards all this?
It's an interesting, it's a mix of attitudes. People are fearful, but at the same time, people love New Orleans. And it's almost, when they open the floodgates to let some of the water out, people will come and watch and kind of throw a party. Like they almost tailgate while watching it unravel. But that was interesting to me because there was a respect for the river, but at the same time, there was this acceptance that I think you see along the whole river with people not wanting to move and people saying, this is our home, we're going to deal with it. And so it's almost just like an accepting attitude of it is what it is, which was really interesting.
Okay. New Orleans is different. We're going to run out of time in just a second. Any question from y'all? Does somebody have a question you want to ask real quick? Yes. Well, Claire probably ran into some interesting people who had some opinions, like the mayor.
Yeah, I asked the mayor that. I said, "What's your relationship like with the Corps?" And he said, 3 words: "We hate them." I was like, "Oh goodness, okay." And they don't hate them because the Corps does a lot to protect them and like educate them about what's going to happen, what is happening. But there's definitely some animosity there. Just because they have, gotten facts wrong in the past, as, humans do. But it was just people in these little towns. And I think at first they thought, I had trouble getting people that would let me interview them because I think they thought I was from the Corps. And there are signs in people's front yards, like in this little town of Bouleros, Louisiana, which is like such a Cajun little French town. It's awesome. But there are signs that say like, don't stop, we don't want to talk, don't wave. Like, I think they've just had, like maybe more journalists come through and want to get their stories. And they just don't want to talk about it because, their lives have been put on hold or, they've wasted a bunch of money. And they blame it on the Corps. So it's a tricky relationship for sure.
Any other questions? Yes. Good.
The 101 students, y'all were invited here not to so much to learn about the river and hydraulics, but to hear from some of the students who've done experiential learning, which is something that's really part and parcel of what the Meek School emphasizes. This is the depth reporting class from spring of 2012, and this is a semester-long course. They decided a topic. They spent all semester planning, reporting, and preparing and publishing a magazine. We do this kind of stuff all the time. We have a report, a magazine in progress from South Africa. We did one last spring from Belize. The first depth report won the Kennedy Prize for Excellence in College Journalism. There's been 2 since then, since the school was created in 2009. But some of the things we talked about in the freshman orientation was how the school likes to do real integrated marketing communication work, real journalism work. Bill Rose and Curtis Wilkie are the 2 Overby Fellows, and I don't know if Curtis is still here or not. Bill was the national editor for the Miami Herald, Palm Beach Post. Curtis Wilkie's background, his career was with the Boston Globe. He's been here about 10 years. And all the members of the faculty with that kind of background lead these experiential programs. They do weekend reporting trips. They do extended trips. They do them with television. They do them with magazines. They do them with newspapers. And a really nice thing is, Margaret Ann, hold up your magazine, the back of it, is that if you participate in this, a standard feature is that your photograph goes on the publication, and it makes a pretty good piece for your portfolio and your resume, and it's also excellent journalism. Okay? Thank y'all.
Thank y'all very much.